Hey, hello, Dr. Rhoda. How are you today?
I'm doing very well. How are you, Pat?
Very
Or
good,
should I,
very good.
or, sh- or should I call you Doctor Pat or Doctor
That Pat
Patel?
is fine. In Quebec, we're less used to calling each other doctor. Actually, there's a law in Canada or in Quebec where I cannot have somebody call me doctor unless I'm a medical doctor. I can write it in
Hmm.
an article unless if I mention that it is a PhD in philosophy, for instance. But I cannot have somebody call me doctor if I'm not a medical doctor or a
Ah,
dentist or a vet. So these are the three.
interesting.
Yeah. So it's actually illegal for me to do so.
Hmm.
So Pat is fine. Yeah, I can put PhD, no problem. But as soon as if I say doctor, then it's a liability because
Hmm.
people can say, well, you're a medical doctor. You said you were. So it's a liability
Hmm.
for us to do so. So it's an interesting factoid in Quebec. I think it's the only place that we have this actually in the whole planet. I'm not sure,
Hmm.
but I think so. Yeah. So, Dr. Rhoda, we're actually together tonight to take a look at your great article here, making sense of the essence energy distinction in the. I guess I'll let you introduce that aspect, but perhaps if you could introduce
Yeah.
yourself a little bit, and then you can just introduce the subject, and then we can just have a chat on it.
Yeah. Okay. Just but by way of introduction to myself and the topic. Um, so my name is Alan Rhoda. I've got a PhD in philosophy. Uh, uh, with a specialty in philosophy of religion, focusing on like models of God and divine providence. Um, that doesn't relate so much to tonight's topic, but uh, uh, about 4 years ago, during the well, maybe five now, during the COVID lockdown period, I started getting interested in Eastern Orthodoxy, and one of the things I encountered uh, when I was listening to YouTube, uh, excuse me, I have a stutter. I can't always articulate when I want to. Um,
Don't worry
uh,
about it.
I watched, yeah, I watched a bunch of YouTube clips of people explaining Orthodox theology, and one of the things that came up again and again was this distinction between God's essence and God's energies. And having been raised as a Protestant, that was like puzzling to me because I had never heard of that. That was like, huh, I wonder what that's all about. And so I uh, looked up a bunch of videos, everything I could find explaining that distinction. And some of it I liked, and some of it kind of got me shaking my head, you know, a bit because it was like, well, I'm not sure if that's the way it ought to be articulated. Um, so I thought about things over time, and I read some books, including one here uh, on divine essence and divine action, exploring the essence energies distinction by Dr. David Bradshaw, um, who is he's a specialist in, I guess, historical theology. So he's traced the development of this distinction from way back in Aristotle through the New Testament and the patristic era all the way forward. And another book that I looked at was this one. It's called Essence and Energies. And the subtitle is Being and Naming God. Excuse me, in Saint Gregory Palamas. Sorry. Uh, if you don't know of him, he is in Eastern Orthodoxy regarded as a very important uh, saint. Um, in the, I think it was in the 14th century or so, he uh, he articulated and he championed this essence energies distinction, um, uh, after it came under fire from some Western scholars who were coming from a broadly, well, from more or less a Thomistic perspective. One that with Thomas Aquinas says God is absolutely simple, and so there, God is His essence, and therefore, divine energies are either identical to the divine essence on that view, or they're completely separate from God, in which case they're just created things. There is no actual participation in God through His energies. So so he was, so he's seen as this great champion of orthodoxy over against a number of theologians who were influenced by Western thought at that time. And so anyway, trying to piece this all together, I decided to sit down and write up as best I could my thoughts on the essence energies distinction to see if I could explain it to myself and therefore to somebody else. And what I argue in my article is, I want to say this distinction is in fact very important because there's a number of doctrines that are central to Christianity that you can only make sense of if you have some such distinction in mind. You may not have to use the exact terminology, right? You can substitute other words, but you're still going to need that distinction at work somehow in your system to make sense of, for example, the incarnation, or to make sense of salvation and our union with God that everything is aiming at. So the distinction's important, but if it's important, though, it's kind of odd as to why in the West, which includes all of Protestant Christianity, the distinction's almost completely unknown. You never hear of it. Right?
Well, it's interesting. I'm sorry. It's interesting because I think that in the West there's such a big deal made out of absolute divine simplicity in a very strong and absolute sense, that the distinction makes no sense, because on the Western view there are no experimental properties in God, and so this distinction just has nothing. I mean, there's no bite to it when in reality in God, it seems to me.
Yeah. So there's an explanation to be offered of, why is this distinction been either denied or neglected in the West? And then in the East, I argue that at least some theologians in the East carry it too far. They wind up drawing the distinction in the wrong place and making sticking too much stuff on the side of God's energies to the point where we can't say anything about the divine essence. And I think that is pretty problematic. So I want to take some issues with both East and West and try to make a case for that this distinction, when properly understood, is actually really important.
Well, I was reading your article and I was thinking to myself, it's as if at some point after they separate, the East and the West is separating, and at one point they join at the point where it's still God is still ineffable. He cannot speak about God. Ineffable. So whether in the East or in the West, at one point, either because of strong divine simplicity or because of this apophatic negative via negativa idea, you cannot really speak positively about God, which seems to me that it just blends. At one point, they go back together.
You get to a similar result, yeah. Maybe I should start by explaining the terminology.
Yeah, that would be a good idea.
Essence
I'm going too
energies.
fast. Yeah, good idea.
Yeah. So, okay. So let's start with essence because that's the easier term to get a grip on. And the essence of a thing is um, is well, it can also call it its whatness. It defines what a thing is and cannot not be. Okay. So, for example, I am a human being. That is my nature or my essence, right? Uh, I am human, and I cannot not be human. If you were to like turn me into something other than human, I would cease to exist, right? I would not be me anymore. You'd be replacing me with something else. So, in essence, uh, the way it's defined and everything, it's something that is necessary to the thing that has it, right? So, the thing is and cannot not be whatever that essence is. So, if God, I think God obviously does. I mean, there are things about God that God cannot that cannot not be true of God. Like, to give the most perhaps the most obvious example, God cannot not exist. So it is essential to God that God exists. Um, God cannot not be loving or good or just or holy or sovereign. Uh, God cannot, I would say, not be omnipotent or omniscient. All of these are plausibly regarded as essential attributes of God, right? That they're ways we can describe God that reflect how God is and cannot not be. But there's other things we might say of God that, at least it's standard in Christian theology to regard as not essential, right? Right. We say, for example, God is a creator. Well, did God have to create? Uh, well, the standard Orthodox position is no, right? God was under no compulsion or necessity of nature to create. And so God could have refrained from creating, and God would have been, just as perfect and complete as God is, right? Um, well, if God didn't have to create, well, then all of the attributes that describe God's relations with particular creatures also can't be essential to God. So we say, uh, when we say that Yahweh is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, well, that's true, but it's not essential because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob didn't have to
They're not
exist.
necessary
God
beings.
didn't have
Yeah.
to be their God, right? Yeah. So that would be sort of a contingent property of God, right? Something that is true of God contingently and not essentially and necessarily. Okay, so um, let's switch terms. Let's talk about the energy term. Okay, um, this term goes way back, at least as far as Aristotle, who used it to primarily describe something's like activity, right? So right now we are talking. So that is a uh, uh, is an energetic, right, activity. It's something we are doing, right? Um, so when you're thinking, you are doing something. So you are being energetic in the Aristotelian sense, right? The word in Greek is energia, which comes from the word ergon, which means work. So whenever you are doing something, you are being energetic. You are expressing energia, right? Um, so Aristotle used it for that, a kind of activity, and then he contrasted it with this notion of dunamis, or which he conceived of as a mere capacity for activity. So in his view, like when I am actively talking, I am, I am being energetic. I am in act, to use the, with respect to speech. But when I shut up, I have the capacity to speak. So, but I'm just in potency, right? I have the ability, but I'm not actualizing that ability,
Definitely.
right?
Yeah.
Now, when we get to the New Testament,
I was going to say, yeah,
yeah.
dunamis is really
Oh,
has a wide range of meaning. I mean, I can come in if the door is open. So the dunamis is like even a mere possibility because the door is locked or unlocked. I mean, I can or cannot go in. So it's really a potentiality that is there, whereas effectively energia is more potent in terms of the meaning of the word.
yeah. Yeah. So, but the word kind of changes over time, and it shows up not just, of course, in Aristotle, who was a Hellenistic philosopher. It also is picked up by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. I don't have a complete list of references of where he uses it, but you could look it up. This up in a concordance. But let me at least mention one verse here, Colossians 1:29. Now, I'll just say this: in the way that Paul uses the word, he doesn't draw this sharp distinction between like energy as activity and this sort of potency or power, like the dunamis, as just as unactualized capacity. He kind of blurs that distinction. And so when he speaks of God's energies, he'll say, like, it's both our capacity for action, both the dunamis and the actual activity itself. The energeia is empowered by God, right? He says, for example, that he strives according to Christ's energy, working effectively, and the word there is also a cognate on energeia, um, in him, in power, and there the word he uses he uses is dunamis. So he's connecting both energeia and the dunamis, both the actual activity and the capacity for activity, are all kind of wrapped up together, and he sees himself as receiving energy, power from God, right? Um, uh, as a bit of, I think, a side note that might help make this make sense to us modern people who, we're not used to maybe thinking quite in these categories. If you've taken any class in physics, you know that they make a distinction between kinetic energy and potential energy, right? That distinction is pretty close to I think how Paul is using the term here when he speaks of God as energizing us. So God is supplying both the kinetic energy, he's helping us, to do what we are actually in the process of doing, but he also uh, uh, makes us able to do the things that he wants us to do. So that's like the potential energy. So it's and just as we use the same term energy for both, right? The activity and the capacity for activity. Uh, that's would line up, I think, with how Paul tends to use it.
Yeah, I was looking over the verses today in preparation for this chat we're having, and indeed in the New Testament, I think all the verses, like Bradshaw was saying, all the verses where energia is used is most probably a spiritual context. Although I have some, it's not clear in Ephesians 4:16, but I'm pretty certain that it is
Mm-hmm.
in the spiritual context, but it is less so in the Septuagint, where it's you have both spiritual and just like the in the sense that you were describing Aristotle's use of it. I think in one or two instances, but definitely in the New Testament, this is more in line with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one point to make is that when we speak of divine energies, this is a biblical concept. Okay, it's not simply an importation into theology from Hellenism. Paul has borrowed a word from the Hellenistic philosophers, but he's appropriated it for his own purposes. Okay, he's not, and so we shouldn't be afraid to use this language because it is biblical language. Of course, it's language that would jump out at you if you read the Bible in Greek. Most of us
Indeed.
don't.
And like I said, it's not only Paul, it goes back to Septuagint, where there is this idea of God's energies. So
Yeah.
I think it's pretty legitimate to use that kind of language. I remember when I first heard this about essence and energy, when I first heard it was early 2000. I said, "Is this some kind of a new age thing?" It was,
Mhm.
but it's certainly not. It certainly is not.
Yeah. All right. So let me talk about the
Listen,
distinction then. So we
we have
talked
a
a bit about
question.
essence. Oh yeah.
Let me
Yeah.
just, we have
Yes.
Hudson is asking a question. I don't think we can really, well, we could if we have time later on, but he's asking, what are your thoughts on the immanent trinity versus the economic trinity? Seems to be influenced by the essence energy idea. If you want to make a comment now or maybe later.
Oh, well, maybe all I can say is I'm not quite sure how to answer that question because number one, I haven't fully thought through my thinking on the Trinity. It's a big subject. What I guess so. How about I pull up a
All
slide
right.
here because we were going to bring this up
Yeah.
anyway at some point, and so I can kind of at least partially respond to the question by way of this picture. So I'm gonna share my screen here real
Sure.
quick and see if I can right here. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Is that visible? Okay, so the Trinity, right? Since we think of as Christians, we think God is essentially triune, right? He's not just that he just sort of happens to be triune, but he is and cannot not be, right? Um, uh, so you'll see here in this diagram that the blue oval that is refers to God's essence, and within that essence we have the distinctions, right, between Father, Son, and Spirit. So that would be the immanent Trinity, right? Now, the economic Trinity, that would relate to how those persons of the Godhead, how they relate to creation. And creation is something that is an energetic production of God's, right? It's something God does, and something God didn't have to do. So it's an extra essential energetic activity of God's. And so each of these, the persons of the Trinity, relates to creation in a certain way, and that gives you the economic facet of the Trinity, right? So the Son becomes incarnate, the Father does not, the Spirit does not, right? The Spirit is the role of the Spirit is to draw all of creation and unite all of creation to the Son, right? The Father remains kind of as the transcendent anchor of the Godhead. He's the one who sends the Son and sends the Spirit, right? But they're all three are working together. They are synergizing, right? In their collective goal to to draw all creation as close to God as possible.
Yeah, I would concur. I think the idea is there's a similarity between the immanent and the economic trinity, and I think it's an interesting mapping of those two concepts, one and the other. But I'm not sure if you can map them perfectly one to the other, because I think, unless I'm mistaken, the immanent and economic trinity is mostly a Western concept, I think, in my reading. And
I think that language goes from Karl Barth
probably, yeah.
or who was the one who invented that distinction. I think there's something to that distinction, but I'm not prepared to say much more about it right now. And it would take us at least a little bit afield to dwell much more on it. But thank you for the question.
Definitely.
All right, let me stop sharing. All right, so where were we? We were talking about the essence energy distinction right now, right? So we've talked about essence, we've talked about energy a bit. Now, how are they distinct? So I think there are actually two different essence energy distinctions. And this is not something you will find discussed in like Eastern Orthodox theology. They generally just talk about the essence energy distinction. But it seems to me that there are actually two different kinds of energies that are relevant, and that gives us two distinctions. So the first and I think easiest case to grasp are what I call God's contingent energies. These are things that God does not have to do, right? Like God doesn't have to create. So if God creates, that's an energy, an activity of God's that is contingent. It's not necessary, right? If God becomes, if the Son becomes incarnate, well, if creation itself is a contingent activity or of God or a contingent expression of God's power, well, then becoming incarnate within creation is also contingent, right? That's not necessary. God's making a covenant with Abraham or responding to somebody's prayers. All of these are things God does, but they're contingent. They are they didn't have to be because all of creation didn't have to be. So those are contingent energies, right? That is kind of one type of essence energy distinction there, right? Between God's essence, what God is and cannot be, and the things God does but didn't have to do. Okay, God's essence and God's contingent energies. The other category is what in Bradshaw's work, he refers to these as God's natural energies. They are things God does essentially by nature, right? Ways in which God just is active. And if you think of the biblical descriptions of God, right, in we're told he is a personal God, right? He is a living God. We're told that God is love, that he is the light of the world, right? At the end, at the end of Revelation, we're told that the light and glory of God will be shared with all of creation for all eternity, right? In the Old Testament, there's all these verses that talk about the glory of God, and on the Mount of Transfiguration, there's this scene where the disciples get to view the glory that Christ has, right, as the divine Son of God. He kind of allows them to see his glory for a time. And so the patristic, like the church fathers, in reflecting on these passages and stuff, thought, well, it just has to be the case that God just by nature is kind of expresses his glory, expresses his life, his love, his light. Um, that this is something God cannot not do, whether there's a creation or not. To use an analogy here, if we think of if we compare God to the sun shining in the sky. Hearing some music in the background, is that
Yeah. I'll just shut the door here. Sorry.
weird? Am I the only
No,
one
you're
hearing
not.
that? Oh, okay. Wasn't sure if that was where that was
My
coming from,
wife
but anyway,
is in the living room
if we
playing
think of
music.
the God. Oh,
She's
okay. Well,
praising the Lord over there.
kind of nice
Yeah.
background, I suppose. Yeah, praise the Lord. Uh, so so a common analogy that was used by a lot of different people is to think of God as the sun. It's obviously the brightest object in the sky, right? We know now that the sun is not just this ball of stuff that just sits there. It's undergoing nuclear fusion, right? The hydrogen is being fused into heavier elements and is releasing lots and lots of energy, right? And it is, if you say, essential to the sun that it be producing electromagnetic rays, that it be producing heat and light. It cannot not give off that. If it were to stop that, right? If all of the fusion that was going on within the sun were to stop, well, we wouldn't call it a star anymore, right? It wouldn't be a sun. It'd just be a
Rock.
block of dead just matter, like a
Yeah.
rock in space, right? So if we think of the sun as being kind of essentially energetic, we can also think of God as being essentially energetic. He's, again, as a personal being, he can't just be static and inert. As the living God, he can't just be like a lump of metaphysical stuff. He's essentially and intrinsically active. So if we accept that idea, then we can call all these ways of acting that God just by nature does, we can just say those are God's natural energies,
So
right? Ways God acts and cannot
because they
not
are
act. And
grounded
those are
directly,
distinct from his contingent energies.
because they are grounded directly in his nature and his essence, and because, like you were saying earlier, the essence of God is what God cannot not be, and therefore these attributes cannot not be because they are grounded in God's essence and God's nature, which is why they're called natural. Correct?
Yeah. So we get two distinctions here, right? God's essence and God's natural energies, and God's essence and God's contingent energies. And I argue in the article that the first, that the relation of God's essence to the contingent energies, I say, is some kind of a real distinction. And that's sort of a technical term, right? There's all this debates in the Middle Ages about exactly what kind of distinction you were making between X and Y. But a real distinction implies some sort of the possibility that you can, this way, if X and Y are really distinct, then it's got to be possible in principle for you to have X and not have Y, or vice versa, right? You can like add or subtract one of those terms, and so when it comes to like God's contingent energy, say his activity of creating, well, if God didn't have to create, then when he does create, he's sort of adding a new kind of determination or specification to his being that didn't have to be there. He said, I now decide to create, right? And so something has changed in God. God has become a creator. And so we've added a contingent determination onto God's being. And so that, I think, makes that a real distinction, right? Whereas with respect to, say, God's loving and God's, his glory and these things that God cannot not express, even if just among the Trinity, right? They're all sharing in the divine glory, in the divine love. That there you don't get a real distinction because you can't subtract love or life or light or glory from God, right? You can't, these energies are essential, right? You can't add them or subtract them. But we can still say that these energies are distinct from the essence. And here I think the term that I'm going to borrow, it goes back to a medieval scholar by the name of Duns Scotus. He said that two things are formally distinct when they cannot exist in separation, but they can be defined or understood without reference to the other. So, in other words, two things are formally distinct if they are not intrinsically identical, but they are nevertheless non-separable, right? That they always go together, right? You can't have one without the other, but they're not identical. So why might we say that, say, the divine glory or the divine love is not identical to God's essence? The way I would try to cash this out is by thinking of perhaps a distinction that's maybe more familiar to us between a disposition or a propensity and its manifestations or its actualization. So for example, if I have like a glass window, right? One of the dispositional properties of that window, at least of your typical window, is that it is breakable, right? It has some fragility, right? You drop a glass, it normally shatters and breaks. But the window can sit there for a long time without anybody like breaking it, right, or throwing a wall at it, or like a rock at it or something, right? So a thing can have a disposition, but the actualization of that disposition is something separate, right, from just the disposition, right? Or like if if I have a rubber ball, right, it has the disposition of like bouncing, right? If I drop it on a hard surface, but I don't ever have to bounce it, right? So the thing has the disposition, whether it's ever bounced or not. But if I do decide to drop it, then I'm going to see an expression or a manifestation or an actualization of that disposition, every time it bounces, right? So I say we can think of God's essence as consisting of a bunch of overlapping propensities or sort of dispositions, like God, his being good, his being wise, being loving, things, all the things that God necessarily is. And we can think of the natural energies of God as actualizations of those propensities, that God acts good, acts wisely, acts lovingly, acts in a way that expresses his glory, and so forth. So all the things that God does that manifest or actualize those propensities that describe how God essentially is. Okay. Now, why would we want to say these two are distinct? I think it's because God is so perfect, right? God is infinitely good, infinitely loving, right? Like the Bible says that, he can do more than we can ask or imagine, right? He's beyond any sort of limits that our finite minds can, set to say how good or how wise or how loving or how powerful he is. And so any way God expresses his love, expresses his power, is only going to be expressing a fraction of the total power God has. Like if God creates a universe, he's expressing a vast amount of power. But could God create another universe in addition to the one he already created? Sure. Could he create another one after that? Could he create an infinite multiverse? I'd say sure. Could he create, there's no end to it, right? And so you can, God's essence is like the source, right? The from which all of these energies flow. But however much God expresses his essence, no expression can ever express the whole of God, right? The only beings, or like the only one who knows the divine essence completely are the persons of the Trinity, because they know the essence of God completely. The rest of us, we only know God through what God does, right? Through the divine energies. And so anyway, I want to say God's essence and God's natural energies are formally distinct, because the energies can never express the whole of the essence, right? There's always more goodness, more wisdom, more love, more power there than God could ever manifest. But nevertheless, God cannot not manifest in these ways. He cannot not be, act good, act wisely, act lovingly, and so forth. But with respect to the contingent energies, those are things God can or cannot, God can not act in those ways. God can not create, can not become incarnate, can not answer so-and-so's prayer, can not make a covenant with Abraham, and so forth. That's up to God,
I was thinking of C.S. Lewis quote that says that when he says, "What must the quality of that being whose far off momentary coruscations are like this?" So I see these energies like these coruscations, like the rays going through the clouds, the rays of the sun going through the clouds, and you're just seeing just light rays, and you're not seeing the sun because you can't, because of the clouds. And I think this is a nice way of putting this
Hmm.
distinction between how the energies can never express what and who God is perfectly because of his majesty and because of our own limitations.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Um, at least, yeah, I think would be fair to say no
yeah,
finite
yeah,
expression
definitely. Yeah, yeah.
of God's essence could
No,
exhaust it.
definitely. And we certainly, I
Um,
mean, we can never grasp anything, even finite things like a flower. It's impossible for us to get down to everything that a flower is. So imagine a being like God who is infinite in so many ways that it's impossible, it's certainly impossible for us to grasp anything like that.
yeah. Um, Another angle to add here is, and this is something that should be familiar to all of us. I mean, when we're learning about the world around us, you know, uh, we discover the essences of things by observing their energies. You know, uh, you you if you spend time with me, you'll learn about what kind of person I am by seeing how I behave under a bunch of different circumstances, right? If you want to say no substance, like copper is, say for example, what is the essence of copper? Well, you have to do some experiments, right? You have to see, well, how does it behave under this circumstance or that circumstance? What's its melting point? What's its uh, what kind of lines does it produce in a spectrograph? And over time, you can piece together these different clues from different experiments and figure out its chemical composition and stuff like that, and how it interacts with other things. But you'll only be able to learn about what things are by observing how they behave, right? And it's the
Yeah,
same way. It's the same thing with God. We know of God by uh, paying attention to and observing what God has done, right? Both in creation, like in Psalm 19, it says, the heavens pour forth speech. They declare the glory of God. Uh, in Romans 2, it talks about how God has written his law on our hearts. And so we have some knowledge of God through what God has done in us, by uh, or through his revelation in Christ, or through the
yeah,
scriptures, right? He's spoken through the prophets and so forth. So if God did not express himself to us in various ways, we would have no way of knowing what sort of God there is, or even that there is a God, right?
exactly,
Uh,
exactly. Yeah. I
um,
think the fact that he reveals himself is certainly the whole is the only way we can know God in any way possible, whether,
yeah,
like you say, through nature, through what he did and how he acted, both in creation and in revelation.
yeah. Um, I think we should move on to the
Yeah,
question of why the distinction is important.
yeah, we've got
Uh,
some really interesting stuff there. Let me just see my notes if I want to touch on something before. I just thought. Uh, you mentioned interesting the let me just see here one aspect I thought was very important. You said in 1.3 a key question concerning God is whether God is identical to the divine essence. If so,
mhm.
then it immediately follows that God cannot change at all. And so we come to the why it is important. But here I think there's
Yeah,
a very important aspect is that if there is no distinction at all, then there is this moral collapse. There's no freedom for God
Yeah.
or us or anything. Everything is necessary.
Yeah, yeah. As soon as you reject the distinction altogether, that there is no distinction in God between essence and energies, you go straight into hardcore classical theism, where you're going to say God is absolutely immutable, absolutely simple, absolutely impassible, and um, and you know, I think when you think through the implications of those things, and most people who affirm those things don't really work through the implications of that very well, you wind up with a picture of God that is uh, very unbiblical, because
And
the biblical, yeah,
no, I was going to say unbiblical, and it's I don't see how you can ascribe personhood to that being, because there's nothing like a person in
yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah, yeah. You
So
get God as
let's go
just a
to
metaphysical principle.
exactly. So let's go to why the essences are important. So the 2.1, I think, which we just almost touched on, is divine freedom.
Yeah. Yeah. Could I
Yes,
share my screen
definitely.
on that?
Yep.
Maybe it might help to just put that part up. Okay, this is from my article that was I posted on my blog. You can kind of see it with me, or your viewers can. All right, so I give 5 reasons why I think the essence energies distinction is important. The first, oh, actually, I need to change this text here. I mentioned 4 reasons in the first paragraph, but I actually list 5. The first 2 relate to God's contingent energies, and the last 3 are going to, well, I guess maybe the 5th one may also relate to his contingent energies, but let's discuss these. Um, the second, or like the 3rd and 4th, pertain to the natural energies. So anyway, the first one, divine freedom. Without a real distinction between God's essence and God's contingent energies, God has no freedom, right? For God to be free to create or not create, free to create, a world of type, A versus a world of type B, free to interact with his creatures, as he chooses, and so forth. He's got to be able to act, to be energetic in ways that are not fully specified by the divine essence. Okay? So without an essence energies distinction, you have no divine freedom. The second point here, and this is also, I think, quite easy to grasp, divine responsiveness to creation, right? For God to act in response to creatures, there's got to be some kind of distinction in God. The way God reacts to people is got to be contingent upon what they do, right? So if you look in the Bible, like at Jeremiah 18 verses 7 to 10, or to Ezekiel 33 13 to 15, they state very explicitly that how God acts is to some extent contingent upon what creatures do, right? So in the Jeremiah, it says that, if God says, I'm going to bless this nation, but then they rebel against me, then I'm going to turn from all the blessings that I had planned to give them, and I'm going to punish them instead. But if I'm planning to punish a nation and then they repent and turn toward me, then I will relent of the disasters that I plan to bring upon them, and I will start blessing them, right? And so God is being responsive to creation. You can't get that if everything God does is built into the divine essence, right?
No,
God,
it's impossible to get it. Yeah,
um,
exactly.
um, um, I think we could mention here the point that you were bringing up, which I actually don't mention in this list here, that if there is no essence energies distinction, which is to say, if God is identical to his energies, then you're going to get one of two things is going to happen. Okay. If we say we take God's activity of creating, you're either going to have to say that everything God does is built into the divine essence, so God cannot not create, and every God's knowledge of creation is going to be just as necessary as the divine essence. In fact, it's going to turn out that everything is necessary, right? You get a modal collapse because everything is then packed into the divine essence. The other way you could go with this is say, well, yes, God is his own essence, but there is also this contingent creation out there. Well, okay, but then God cannot have anything to do with that contingent creation. And so you get a God who literally can neither know nor care about creation. Because
You
if
end up
any
with
of that,
deism.
yeah, you would get an extreme form of deism, right? Because if any of this contingent information about creation got into God somehow, well, then God would no longer be absolutely simple. He wouldn't be identical to his essence anymore. But if we stipulate that the essence and energy are identical, well, then you've got to exclude anything contingent. Can't be squeezed into God. And so God becomes essentially indifferent to creation, right? And that is not the God of, say, John 3:16, who loved the world that he gave his only begotten
Exactly.
son.
Which leads us to
All right.
2.3 about the Incarnation, a very important aspect.
Yeah. Right. So the Orthodox, and here I'm using small o Orthodox, right? Christian doctrine of the Incarnation requires a distinction between God's essence and God's natural energies, right? The reason is because on the Orthodox view, in Christ, you have one person, right, who has two natures, right? And this person, the Son of God, is a divine person, right? So he's a divine person with two natures, a human nature and a divine nature. So in order for this to work, God the Son has to, as it were, take human nature, humanity, into his person. Okay? The way I think this works, at least the best way I've been able to make sense of this in my own mind, is to suppose that the Son kind of within his person, the Greek word is hypostasis, right? Within his hypostasis, he sets up a kind of a human-sized, human-structured psychological space within himself, and then he joins that human space to a human body, and so he's got both a human mind and a human will, because they're defined by that human-sized psychological space. But because this space exists wholly within the person of the Son, it's not its own independent person, right? It's a kind of a sub-hypostatic or sub-personal space. It's not like sub-personal as in non-personal, but it's within the person of the
wholly
Son,
dependent
right?
on the Son.
Yeah. It's not an independent
Exactly.
person,
Yeah.
right? That you get from Nestorianism, which was a heresy. But so anyway, to join humanity and divinity within Christ, the divine person of the Son, his humanity has to be, the fancy word here is hypostasized by the divine Son. The Son, his person, to human nature, right? He brings human nature, as it were, he brings humanity kind of within his person, right? He hypostasizes it. But that means that Christ's humanity is divinized by the Son, right? His humanity participates in the Son's own divine life, right? How could humanity participate in divine life if God was, if God's essence and energies are identical? Then the only way anything can participate in God is by becoming God's essence. But humanity can't become the essence of God, right? That would destroy humanity, right? The essence of God is, among other things, to be, excludes being a creature, whereas human nature entails being a creature. So you cannot join humanity and divinity as in the Incarnation through the divine essence. The only way you can join the two is by distinguishing God's energies, something that is in addition to the divine essence, and saying that God brings humanity into connection with that, with his natural energies. And so when the Son brings humanity into his person, he also unites his human self with his divine energies. His human self is sort of divinized, or it's brought into the eternal divine life of the Son itself.
Which makes
So,
sense. When I
and
was,
that's God's goal for us too, right?
yeah,
That eventually he wants us to be, when we're saved, we become, as it were, in Christ, right? That's the word that's used over and over again in Paul's letters, right? You are now in Christ. He wants to bring us into full union with himself, not his essence, because that would destroy us, right? It would destroy the creator-creature distinction, but with his divine energies. When we get eternal life, it's not like a quantity of life that we get, life that never ends. It's really, and more importantly, it's us sharing in God's own
I think,
life.
yeah, being joined with him and therefore participating in his eternality.
In at the end of Revelation, it describes, how, what this will look like. It talks about how there will be no more sun or any other light. God will be the light of everything. His energy will infuse all of reality without obliterating the distinction between God and creation. Right.
Correct. Yeah.
And so that brings us to theosis, which is the fourth point. This is a term that may not be familiar to a lot of Protestants. It's a Greek term, so it shows up a lot in Eastern Orthodox thought. But it's a biblical concept. There's a verse where I think Peter talks about how we become partakers of the divine nature,
Yeah.
things like that, or how we become that we will become like him, for we will see him as he is. Well, how can we, so the Eastern view is that salvation is theosis. That is, it's us becoming fully transformed into the likeness of Christ. Um, you know, um, we already, we are created in the image of God, but we aren't created in the likeness of God. That's something that has to be developed, that has to be uh, uh, formed in us, as it were, right? And so as we become sanctified, this is a process of theosis, where we become more and more Christ-like. And the end of this process is we will be as we will be uh, uh, we will be as divinized in our humanity as Christ's human nature was in the Incarnation.
Yeah.
Right.
So I want to be mindful of your time because I think you had a hard close at 8:30.
Yeah, I can go a little bit
All right.
further. Um, maybe I skip this next part about divine
Well, let me
conservation
just mention.
because that goes on for a
Let
little
me
bit.
mention something about divine conservation. I was thinking that
Yeah.
this, if you lose the distinction, you get rid of creation ex nihilo. Period. Because creation becomes necessary, and you cannot have God without creation if creation is necessary.
Yeah. Right. And that's what happened with Origen. He uh, he affirmed absolute divine simplicity, and so he said, well, the Father, we call the Father creator. If God is his essence, well, then everything God does must be essential to God. So God must be essentially a
Exactly.
creator. But he said the Father is also essentially Father. And so he had no way to distinguish between the father-son relationship and the creator-creature relationship. And that later came back to bite the church when Arius showed up, and he said, well, if the father-son relationship is on the same level as the creator-creature relationship, well, he thought that rather than affirming a necessary and eternal creation like Origen did, that it made more sense to affirm that to put the Son on the level of creation. So the Son becomes a created being, right? And so you get a whole bunch of Christological
Heresy.
heresies that start springing up
Because
out of
in my
that idea.
mind, the model, this kind of model of God where there's loss of distinction, either collapses into Sabellianism or Arianism. Either you collapse, God, the distinctions become only modal, or you lose,
Yeah,
or you collapses into Arianism, where the Son becomes just a mere creature.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I agree with that. It's going to go one
Yeah.
way or the other. Um, uh, so I don't know if we have time to talk about divine conservation. We could try to do that in a
You know what?
follow-up
I think this is such a
uh,
nice and
or something
interesting
like that.
conversation. I love a follow up. Oh, hello. So I'd love to do a follow up
Look at
episode,
you.
a conversation on this. So we could certainly go,
Yeah,
just perhaps do a recap and then follow through, because I mean you've got a lot of stuff still in the article. I put the link
yeah.
in
Do,
the
do you,
description box, and I really encourage everybody to go and read that article. Very great stuff.
yeah. All right. Well, me just wrap up with like
Sure.
5 minutes. I'll just give my quick take, and maybe in a follow up talk we can delve into this a bit more fully. Uh, so we've talked some reasons about why this distinction is important, but that raised the question: why is it so kind of unknown in Western Christianity, both Roman Catholic and Protestant? Um, I think the main reason there is starting with Augustine, who was not influential in the East, but became hugely influential in the West. The Western Church started to affirm absolute divine simplicity. And if you affirm that, then you're saying that God is identical to the divine essence. And if God is the divine essence, then there's no room to squeeze any essence energies distinction in there. Yep. Um, my daughter's trying to bring the dog into the
I
picture,
love
but
it.
anyway,
Beautiful dog.
and yeah, so in the West, particularly in the medieval West, the essence energies distinction was usually flat out rejected. Okay, hope you gotta be real quiet. Okay.
I'm gonna go downstairs.
Okay.
After you're done
Okay.
with your meeting.
Just be quiet. I'll see you. Okay.
After you're done with your meeting, you have to teach me.
Okay. Not now. Not now. Not now. Not now.
I love it.
Uh,
Oh,
sorry
no,
about
no,
that.
no problem at all. Hey, this is great.
Okay. Yeah. So by the time you get to the modern era, say like you've got Protestants and other Roman Catholics, a lot of that medieval background has been forgotten by now. Not everyone today. In fact, a lot of Protestants probably, well, in some circles, I suppose they would, but a lot of Protestants don't even know anything about absolute divine simplicity and would see no reason to affirm it. But they've inherited these centuries of tradition in the West, where the essence energies distinction has just fallen by the wayside, right? And so they're not used to that language anymore. And when, say, a person from an Eastern perspective starts talking about it, they're like, huh? You know. So I think that's why you've got this Western neglect of it, right? Just the language fell out of use because it was rejected in the High Middle Ages by people who affirmed absolute divine simplicity. In the East, I think the main problem was they affirmed this essence energies distinction. In fact, you need it to make sense of the incarnation. And so they were not going to throw out the distinction. But around the late 5th century, there was this in-house dispute in the church after the Council of Chalcedon, or Chalcedon, I guess is how I prefer to say it. But and within this dispute, there emerged these documents by a guy who styled himself as a disciple of the Apostle Paul from the 1st century. He referred to him. Sorry, I'm sorry, having trouble articulating. He referred to himself. He refers to himself. Sorry, as Dionysius the Areopagite. I think it's Acts chapter 17 or makes a reference to this individual. And so he writes a lot of stuff that's addressing other people who were contemporary to the 1st century. He addresses some letters to the Apostle John. He addresses a number of things to Timothy and some stuff to Titus. And he's addressing them like he's a contemporary of theirs. And like he's got equal authority almost, except he shows some deference to John because he's one of the 12. And so all these writings emerge on the scene while the church is in the midst of this controversy. And one side of that controversy glommed onto these writings immediately and said, here's a 1st century authority that supports our side. And the other side of the dispute, not wanting to be outdone by this, took a look at these writings that of this guy who we now refer to by the name of pseudo Dionysius, because we recognize today that these writings were a 5th century forgery, that they were a person trying to pass his stuff off as though he were a 1st century writer when he was really writing in the 5th century. So the one side glommed on to his writings and said, this is an authority from the 1st century, an Apostle Paul who supports our cause. And the other side, well, we can't let our opponents have that guy on their side. So they looked closely at his writings and said, well, I think we can find a way to read his writings in a way that agrees with us. And so they said, okay, we support this guy too. He's our guy. not yours. And so both sides of this controversy wound up endorsing these writings as being almost divinely inspired. And so it didn't exist in the first 4 or so centuries of the Christian church. All of a sudden, they're invested with a huge amount of authority. Well, what did these writings say? They were they were the writings of a guy who is a Christian Neoplatonist. Okay, so he affirmed, at least implicitly, absolute divine simplicity.
Definitely.
Well, in the East, they had already rejected absolute divine simplicity, so they couldn't. So they had to find a way to try to get this into their system without denying the essence energies distinction. And the way I think they wound up doing this is by saying that the divine essence is absolutely simple, right? So whereas like in the West, like with Augustine Aquinas, they'd say God is absolutely simple. And so there is no essence energies distinction. In the East, they said, well, there is an essence energies distinction, but the essence part of that distinction is absolutely simple. And where that led them, and I explained this in my article, and I won't have time to go into this here, is it led them to what we call extreme apophaticism, or what's otherwise known as negative theology about the divine essence. In other words, we cannot know or say anything about the divine essence. We can only talk about the divine energies. So I think in the East, because of this influence of Neoplatonism that emerged in the 5th century, that kind of pushed them in this direction, they take the essence energies distinction a bit too far, at least further than they need to go with it, than they should go with it. So anyway, you've got Western neglect and Eastern enthusiasm,
Over enthusiasm
for the distinction. That.
All right. Well, listen. This was a.
I'll just kind of leave it there.
Yeah, exactly. And this was a great conversation. I'm really happy we set this up. And if you're willing, we could continue next time and finish your article. What do you think about that? Alan? Oh.
That would be just fine. Yeah.
Excellent.
They talk about divine conservation of creation could be a show in itself, because it's
definitely
something that we talk about all the time. God creates and sustains, but what does that mean? What is sustaining? And I would suggest that to make good sense of the essence or of divine sustaining, you're going to need something like an essence energies distinction. If you don't have that, you're going to run into problems, I think. But
well, this is a great twin perspective. So listen, God bless you. Thank you so much. And well, to our listeners, God bless you.